Yeah, thank you very much for that warm welcome and nice introduction. And as Stefan already said, so this is the most important message. You made it already. I'm a political philosopher. So I have to tell you something about what political philosophy might contribute to this conference, because it's not so much about practicalities, it's not much about activism. There are much more competent people here than I am. But I think there is, among other things, that I'm also interested in one thing that is pretty important and has always been in political philosophy, and that is the question what it is to make a political argument. And as the title already announces, I will talk about sentience as a political argument. And I will then make a very simple division in my talk. In the first talk, I will say a few words about the nature and specificity of political arguments. And then in the second part, I will make some inferences to sentience and ask whether sentience can be a good political argument, especially if you compare it to other kinds of arguments that, for example, animal welfare or animal rights activists are advocating. So first part, what is a political argument? Very roughly speaking, we find two pretty different approaches of what a political argument might be. I will just mention briefly one that you might already be familiar with. So many people would say, beginning, for example, with the Renaissance thinker Niccolo Machiavelli, and in the early 20th century also Max Weber, that a political argument essentially is a means in a struggle for power. And in that sense, a good political argument essentially is an effective argument. So it's an argument that works well if it convinces, for example, enough people in order to stay in power or to enter politically influential positions or the like. And if you have this kind of approach, you are not primarily interested in the quality and substance of an argument, whether it's a really convincing kind of argument, but it's mostly about effectiveness. And that, of course, is one of the issues that is crucial for this conference too. So I will not deny in the following that it is irrelevant whether political arguments in that first sense are effective in convincing people, in changing their minds, in gaining broader publics for urgent issues such as animal welfare and animal rights. Nevertheless, I want to mostly elaborate on an alternative approach of what a political argument is. And this alternative approach is a moral or moralized one. And to give you just two names, not too many, for example, the famous philosopher of justice, John Rawls, understood political arguments in the second sense, and also here in Germany, in a way, Jürgen Habermas. And in the second moralized sense, a political argument is an argument that is addressed to a public which consists in citizens as free and equal persons. And then a good political argument is one that has essentially two features. The first feature is that it is substantially good. I will say a few words about what this could mean in a minute. But that is one thing. And the second thing is that you should argue in a way that also expresses respect to your fellow members of the public or to your fellow members of the demos you are part of, so that they can feel respected as free and equal members of the demos or of the public by the way you are arguing towards them. So the idea behind that is that especially if you aim at, for example, changing laws and aiming at the enforcement of new laws, for example, in order to make animal protection more effective, then you have to present reasons that free and equal co-citizens can at least share or accept, in the sense that they think that the process that leads to that kind of conclusion is a fair one, so that they are not disregarded in their quality as co-citizens. If we want to find a kind of basic norm underlying this idea, one might talk about, for example, deliberative respect. It's a term that can be found in the writings of another influential political philosopher of our times, Philip Pettit. But it's also, I think, underlying the theory of democracy of Jürgen Habermas, among others. So, in that sense, if you combine this with an image of democracy, it's the idea that democracy is not just about aggregating fixed preferences that are given in a citizenry, but democracy is essentially about public deliberation in the sense of giving and taking arguments in order to convince as many people as possible in their role as free as equal co-members or co-members of the citizenry or of the broader public. And what is particularly political about that is the following basic problem. We are confronted with political problems if we, first of all, have to find solutions for collective action problems. We have to overcome collective action problems in order, for example, to justly distribute goods, or to coordinate our behavior so that not so many people get hurt than before. And secondly, in trying to do so, in trying to find collectively binding solutions for collective action problems, you cannot presuppose that all members of the public will ultimately share your substantial views. Say it negatively, in a democracy you have to be aware of the fact that there are many, many issues that are contested and most likely will remain contested, though there is deep disagreement, because the members of a modern democratic society come from different comprehensive doctrines, as Rawls called it, or worldviews, religious as well as atheist, as whatever you want. And it is not a fair expectation that this will end sometimes. So pluralism and disagreement is an ongoing problem. And so politics and making good political argument is essentially about a fair way of dealing with this fact of deep disagreement in the face of the necessity to finding collectively binding solutions that are acceptable for all. So that is the background picture. And then, given that picture, what might count as a good political argument? First of all, and that follows, I guess, immediately from what I just said, you have to distinguish between an argument that is good in the sense of, for example, being substantively well placed in the context of a scientific seminar or a scientific community discussion. So, for example, I as a political philosopher could make a good argument in the sense that my co-philosophers would appreciate the way I'm arguing. But the broader political public is not in that sense philosophically trained. So that is a difference. And it is also a difference whether I'm talking to a sort of an ethical community which already share with me some substantial, maybe religious or irreligious views, and then I think simply have to address this particular kind of pre-understanding of things and say, well, from this it follows that or that. By contrast, a good political argument is one that must be as good as possible given the fact of pluralism that I was already talking about. And I will very briefly mention 4 features of political arguments that make them good in that particularly political sense. First feature is and it's not only a feature that political arguments have to relate to, but among others, they also, a good argument has to be compatible as far as possible with well-established findings of the sciences, particularly not only empirical sciences, and the least controversial aspects of science should be ones that should be compatible with the argument you try to make. Compatibility with well-established findings of sciences, that's one feature. A second feature is that it should also be compatible as far as possible with strong and widespread moral intuitions that are shared at least in large parts of the citizenry you are addressing by your way of arguing. So, just as an explanation, by moral intuitions, I mean simply pre-theoretical, deeply held convictions. And a third feature that makes an argument a good one, or is necessary for an argument to be a good one, is that it is logically consistent and maximally coherent. Arguments can be more or less coherent, and other things being equal, an argument is better than another competing argument if it is more coherent. And a fourth feature is that it should also be capable of providing new insights where this is required, and broadening our ways of thinking. So in the sense in which Hannah Arendt, following Immanuel Kant here, talked about erweiterte Denkungsart. So broadening our horizon is also a possible quality of a good argument. And I will then, and I now come to my second main point, I will then apply this idea to sentience as a political argument, say a few words about that. I do not have to say too much about sentience, I guess. What sentience presupposes is the possibility of subjective experiences, which could also include feelings, intentional stances, propositional stances, which have a certain valence in the sense of being good or bad for the subject of the very experience. So a paradigm instance of experience with a negative valence, of course, would be pain, consisting serious pain, and other kinds of suffering, terror, fear, and the like. So if a being has sentience in that sense, it has interests. And some interests clearly are morally relevant. So when we are deliberating among us as human persons about what should matter morally and what could be regards in which we have to respect and regard each other, then we, among other things, clearly refer to the fact of our vulnerability, of the fact that our lives can be ended, and that we can feel pain and normally try to avoid it, and the like. And now from that, one can easily infer a certain kind of argument, sentience as an argument, and it's the following argument. There are many institutionalized practices today that cause countless animals, sentient animals, pain and suffering. And these institutionalized practices cannot be justified with human purposes of comparable moral importance. So if you compare the interests of the animals at stake, you find basic interests in life, in freedom from pain and terror, in elementary forms of social companionship, in freedom of movement, or maybe also agency and the like. And on the other hand, you find human interests that are particularly irrelevant. They are vanity interests, so to speak. For example, in the taste of meat. You all know that, so I don't have to convince you on that point. So the argument would then be, given that sentience is morally important, because with sentience there comes some morally relevant interests, then at least you must accept that you can only hurt a sentient being, an animal or human being in that regard, if there is something of comparable moral weight at stake for other beings or for the same being in other respects. And if this is not the case, then this kind of practice has to be abolished, at least in principle. So if that's an argument, why is it an argument that is compatible with the four features that make arguments good political arguments I just mentioned? Again, very briefly. As concerns the criterion of compatibility with well-established findings of science, this kind of argument referring to sentience is compatible at least with Darwinian evolutionary biology, which shows us the biological continuities, which are also continuities with regard, for example, the capability of feeling pain and other things. And it's also compatible with the findings of cognitive ethology, which illustrate more and more how clever other non-human animals are in this or that regard, which also means that they are in many regards vulnerable beings, that they, for example, can have interest in some kind of agency, of companionship, of communication, and the like. The second feature I mentioned for an argument to be a good argument is its compatibility with strong and widespread moral intuitions in the sense of pre-theoretical moral convictions. And there is at least one basic intuition, I think, that is addressed by that argument, and this is a very simple intuition. We've heard it already at that conference, that it is wrong to causing unnecessary suffering to sentient individuals. The third feature is such an argument must be consistent and maximally coherent. And I guess this kind of argument is more coherent than the current condition of consciousness that underlies, for example, the German animal welfare laws, and also the practices that are widespread today in our meat-eating society. Because animal welfare law, even in Germany, which is comparatively progressive in that regard, still allows to harm countless animals for reasons that are morally irrelevant compared to what is at stake on the sides of the animals that suffer from it. So there is a clear discrepancy between this kind of lip service paid to the principle of not harming someone unnecessarily, and on the other hand, the fact that it is clearly unnecessary what we do to countless animals by means of institutionalized practices. And that brings me to the fourth feature I mentioned. I said that a good political argument, as far as is required, should also, in a way, provide us with new insights and broaden the way we think about issues. And in that regard, I think it's clear that the argument from sentience I presented allows for quite radical conclusions given the status quo. Namely, for example, it follows quite immediately that the entire complex of industrial farming, that large parts of animal testing, that harming animals for purposes such as meat consumption of dairy products, sports, entertainment, and so on and so forth, that this is all unjust and unjustified. So it should be abolished in principle. So these are the merits of the argument. Again, very roughly, I want to say a few words about the comparative strengths of the argument. So I now want to compare it very shortly with other ways of argument that you sometimes find in the animal advocacy movements, animal rights movements, animal welfare movements. The first thing is, you could talk about animal rights. You could make your case in a rights talk way. And I personally, as a philosopher, prefer to talk about animal rights. I prefer an animal rights position, which has the reason, just to mention that that I want to indicate that I'm not a utilitarian from the start, but I have another starting point. But for a broader public, this is not the kind of difference that is relevant at first place. So you need a lot of philosophical explanation, first of all, to make clear what the consequences of that kind of disagreement are, and then you of course need much more arguments to defend your view in, for example, against utilitarians or virtue ethicists also. For a broader public, for which we design political arguments, I think this is of minor importance. So for example, the argument of sentience that I just indicated does not presuppose something that some advocates of animal rights associate with rights, namely that rights are close to absolute, that they can almost never overridden by regards of collective welfare or Gemeinwohl or whatever, or that rights are strictly egalitarian. I leave that open at that point. I'm an egalitarian in a way, but I think for the argument to work, it is not necessary to commit yourself to this kind of consequence. Another way of making the case for animals is in terms of animal dignity. And again, you might do so. Many people find a rhetoric of dignity especially moving. It's also the case in the human rights debate, where many think that when you talk about human dignity, that has a motivational force, that mere rights talk is lacking. And this might be so, but on the other hand, if you say that animals have dignity, many people might spontaneously say, yes, that's true. And that's what I'm feeling also. But others would say, this is loose talk. It's mere rhetoric. It doesn't have any informational content. So you can simply say the argument from sentience is, in comparison with a dignity argument, first of all, metaphysically more modest, and secondly, it's more straightforward, because it directly addresses what is morally problematic about the way we make use of sentient animals. The third thing is animal exploitation. Yeah, it makes good sense to say we should end animal exploitation if that means that we make use of the contributions and features of living beings for human purposes in a way that, first of all, harm these beings, and secondly, are not justified by interests of comparable moral weight. But if you think about exploitation, for example, in the Marxist sense of the word, where it's about equivalences or true equivalences in exchange relations, that might be something that animals are not directly interested in, because they don't have a sense of justice, of just exchange or so. So you don't need that. The sentient argument makes the point already that practices are exploitative in the sense that they are unnecessarily harming animals that humans use, and that is the factor that makes this practice problematic. And a last example for what might be an argument that is good for certain audiences, for certain contexts, which might also be a good argument, for example, with regard to some findings of science, but you don't need it in the public debate. It's the argument that we should liberate animals. The animal liberation argument that Martin Balloch made. Of course, it clearly indicates the point from where Balloch and others start. They think that rights are about emancipation, and we also have to emancipate countless animals, or help them to emancipate themselves, some would even say, from these exploitative and harmful practices that we subject them to. One might say so. But on the other hand, the rhetorics of animal liberation might be problematic if it brings with it the idea that animals have a certain kind of interest in leading self-determined lives and being autonomous. And now it's a long and complicated debate in which senses animals can be self-determined, or enjoy liberties, not only of movement but also of action, for example. But I think the argument of sentience makes clear that hindering animals from moving freely, hindering animals from following their own will, is problematic to the degree that it causes them to suffer if it diminishes their experiential well-being. That is the ultimate problem with confinement, with keeping animals in captivity and the like. And you might also have the philosophical view that at least some animals, some clever, developed, sophisticated animals might even be autonomous in a stronger sense. But I think in order to convince publics which are not as a whole convinced in that regard, it makes much more sense again to refer to sentience here. So how many minutes are left if there should be time for...
-5.
Right?
-5.
Okay. Then I stop here. I think the point, I hope it had become clear enough. So the idea is not that other kinds of argument might be valid, that you cannot express them, that you cannot discuss them in a philosophical seminar, for example, or an in-group discussion. But if you want to make an argument that can convince a broader and heterogeneous political public, then you have to argue as inclusive and non-sectarian as possible. And the argument of sentience I just sketched should be compatible with this requirement. Thank you for your patience, and I'm looking forward to it.